Hi everyone, welcome back to Art of the Part. In this video, we're going to continue on with MasterCam and I'm going to explore two different 2D milling operations. And these are going to be more simplistic in that we're going to use face milling to cut away the extra stock material. And then we're going to look at some contour milling, which is just going to be the outside island of the 98431 part that we have in front of us. So I'm going to now move back into my Toolpath tab. And inside Toolpaths, you'll notice that we have a 2D file folder collection as well as a 3D multi-axis. And if you hit the drop-down arrow in all of these, you'll see that there's more icons that are all logged in each one of these. Typically, you're just going to find whatever operation that you're doing, so like a 2D operation. And when I hit that drop-down menu, I'm going to look for face milling, for instance. So I'm going to click on face, and it's going to then create a, if I can move this window, Toolpath Group 1 is creating a facing operation in that first icon underneath Toolpath Group 1. And whenever you're selecting Toolpath, it's asking you to either use wireframe geometry or 3D geometry, and it's giving us a couple options in how we can select it. So the first piece of geometry that I want to use for face milling is that wireframe bounding box that we created. So instead of relying on the solid geometry, which is the blue box that's filled in, I'm going to use this wireframe mode over here in the solid chaining. And then it's going to change to wireframe chaining. And I will then select just a solid chain here. And when I click on one of these top blue lines of my wireframe, you'll notice that I have more arrows that I can either choose or select from. If you want to, you can select this red arrow all the way around. I think even easier is just to hit the fast forward button right here, so it's endpoint forward inside of this chaining toolbar here. So I'll click this 3 times, and that's going to go all the way around the top of our face there at the Z0. I'll hit the green check mark, and then it's going to open up this 2D toolpath facing. So this is the bread and butter of all of the toolpath operations and how you set up your settings inside of MasterCam. So we've already selected what kind of toolpath type we're doing, so it's facing, and the chain geometry is right there. That's what we just clicked. If I have to make any changes, if I forgot to select a piece of geometry, I can always click on this again. I can right click and I can rechain all, and I can click through it once again if I wanted to. So you have total flexibility to go back in and manipulate those selections. We're going to go into Tool now, and inside of Tool, this might be a little bit overwhelming when you're using a stock machine. So if we go in here to Select Tool Library, you'll notice that there are quite a bit of tools that we can choose from. In this specific instance, I have 446 tools that are in this specific library. We're obviously not going to use all of those when we're going through this 98431 part. And I'm going to try to whittle this down and filter it out by then going into Filter. And you can see here we have an array of different icons that we can select from. I always just hit none so that it doesn't select any. And then if I'm using a face mill, for example, I know what the face mill looks like. And you can also hover your mouse over all these icons and it'll tell you what they are. So this would be a end mill flat, end mill sphere, which is a ball mill, end mill bull mill, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to click on the face mill, which is the 4th icon, and then I'll hit the green check mark. So now when I go back into Select Tool Library, it actually filters it down to just a handful of tools instead of the whole 446 options that we had before. I know that I have a 3-inch face mill in our machine, so I'll click on 3-inch face mill, hit the green check mark. We have some standard speeds and feeds that are set up with whatever tool that we're pulling from that library. I'm not going to go into changing these quite yet, so I'm just going to add a comment now and just say 3-inch face mill, which is helpful because when we export this out as G-code and we see the whole post, then I can look for specific instances of where those notes are, and I know where that note starts or where that operation starts and ends. So to always put a comment in with whatever tool that you're using. Holder, we're going to leave that stock. Cut parameters. This is just how the tool is going to cut in what direction. So for example, we can have it just cut one way and come across and then come back and cut again. I'm going to do something that's simple, but it's also bad for the tool in this instance. This is just more or less for educational purposes. and how to understand it, but we're just going to do one pass. So we're going to use the entire tool and we're going to try to cut away the entire face. So I know that the part, its width there is 2.5 inches and I have a 3-inch face mill. Well, I can cut across that entire face using the entire face mill. It's going to be bad because it's going to create heavy chip load on that face. We'd rather have it like come in with a radius so that we have thick to thin, thick to thin, thick to thin chips. But in this instance, when we're coming across, it's going to be thick, 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 pretty much until the halfway point. So we're going to do one pass. I'm not going to change any of these other pieces of information. I will go out down here to stock to leave on floor. I'm going to go to 0 and just come across the top. Depth cut, you can see this inside of whatever tool that you're using from the manufacturer if you look at their catalog. In this instance, our 3-inch face mill, it can only cut 3 millimeters down. So in an educational setting, I'm going to turn on depth cut and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to only go, half of that, which would be 60 thousandths down. Just look at your tool, whatever one that you're using, and it also depends on what kind of operation that you're doing. So if you're doing like high-speed milling, you're only taking like little cuts at a time. You can obviously go like way deeper, but in this instance, when we're doing one pass, I don't want to go any more than 60 thousandths across per pass. And what this is doing is it's taking the distance that we're going to be setting up for Z0 and the top of the stock, and it's going to be dividing it out into the number of passes by 60 thousandths increments until it hits 0. We can also create a finish pass, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to let the program figure that out itself. Linking parameter, this is important. I always program in absolute, so I encourage you guys to also program in absolute. I'm going to turn my clearance on, just make that 1, and then I'm going to change all these options to absolute, absolute, absolute. So now that I know where my depth of cut is at 0, and my top of stock is 275 above that. If you see a value where this is 0 and this is not, if it's like -300 or something, you might have clicked on the wrong piece of geometry. We can also override this a little easier too by just clicking on these depth or top of stock icons. And I can select, for example, this is my Z0. Any position on the Z0 I can select and it'll pick up 0 for that dimension. You can go down here into planes and make sure that this says new top, new top, new top, just linking itself back to that new top plane that we created. And then inside coolant, I can just turn my flood on. Once you've already set up these settings, it's usually going to remember them for the next toolpath, so you won't always have to go back into here. So I'll hit the green check mark on this first face mill. I'll zoom out a little bit, and I'll explain how to see a simulated version of this toolpath. So right now I can see my blue lines are coming across and they're going down in those 60 thousandths increments. And I can see how that tool moves by selecting the waves over here in the toolpath group. So if you look for the waves, you're going to hover over it and it says backplot setting operations. So when I click on backplot settings, you will then simulate a tool for whatever operation is selected. So you can see over here in my toolpath group, I have a blue check mark that is over the file folder of the facing operation that I just created. So that's telling me that it's going to simulate the back plot of that specific operation. And then you just hit the play button and you'll see that it's going to then travel with that blue geometry. And that yellow geometry is actually good to see too, because that's the rapid that's moving back to its original location. So we're seeing something interesting with this toolpath we just created. I'm identifying a couple things right here. First, that there's a lot of wasted time going up to that rapid clearance and then coming back over. And then also that it's going a little bit too far off the part. So we can actually manipulate that geometry or that toolpath geometry after it's already been created. So I'll hit the green check mark here in the black backplot. And I'll then go over here to my toolpath tab over here on the left-hand side. And then I'll go and double click on parameters under facing that first operation. So I'll double click on that. It's going to bring me back into the parameters window here. And I'm going to go and click on cut parameters. And I'm going to change this. So this is the overlap. So now I'm going to change my exit and approach distance. Sorry. So instead of it being 50% off the face, I'm going to make it 25%. And 25%. And what this is doing is it's going to reduce the distance it's traveling off that face from left and right, the approach and exit distance. So if I hit the green check mark here, you're going to notice that this blue line is going to shrink by half. And then we'll double click on parameters once again, and then we'll go over here to depth cuts. And inside depth cuts, we're going to choose to keep the tool down. So when we click on keep tool down, which is located right here, it's going to remove that rapid every time that it's going around from one side to the other. So I'll hit the green check mark. And now when we go back into our back plot, which is the waves, the little blue waves right there, let's take a look at how this looks now. So before it was coming across a little bit too far and then coming up. Now it's just going back down and it's doing one pass back and forth. And again, it's kind of bad for the tool, but it's easier for us to understand this type of geometry as we're starting to enter in the face milling. All right, then I'll hit the green check mark, and now I can continue safely on into my contour steps. So I'm going to go back in here to toolpaths up here in this tab. Looks like I accidentally clicked off of it. And then I can click contour right here. I can hit the drop down again and choose contour once again. And you'll notice that we have a contour that was selected in our toolpath group once. Now this is our second operation. And one thing I want to kind of point out here, when we're talking out in the shop floor, usually when we talk about operations, we talk about operations as how many times it has to move inside of the work holding and how many programs are associated to that. Inside of MasterCam, it's a little bit different in the sense that every toolpath that we're creating is also called an operation. So you might see toolpath group 1, which is operation 1, and then toolpath group 2, which is operation 2, and then inside each one of those operations are 5 or 6 or 7 different operations. So just keep that in mind as we start to go through some of these different kinds of toolpath. So now I will be choosing geometry for our contour milling. And inside contour milling, I don't have any wireframe to reference anymore. So I'm going to go over here to the solids icon, and I'm going to move this window out. This window just tells you, easy ways to select geometry here. Usually it's giving you an option, or like a direction rather, of what you have to do next to move on to that next step. But inside of the solids here, I'm going to make sure that I have a solid loop here as well as faces selected. I can also deselect face, but these are the two that I usually keep on the most. So now when I have loop selected, you can hover over your geometry that is connected via tangency. So for example, I want to select the contour right here, and I'm going to go around the entire part. Move this down here a little bit, move this window out, and I want to select the geometry that looks like this. And it's hard to kind of get this the first couple times. You might accidentally click this square here, this rectangle here, but you want to get to a point where you can select this point of tangency so it's getting the entire island. And it's important as well where you are selecting on that line of tangency, because for example, if I select up here, my arrow is going to go down, and that's going to create a conventional milling operation, which is not necessarily what we want to do for this island here. I want it to be climb milling. So I don't want it to be going counterclockwise. I want it to be going clockwise. So I'm going to then select this unselect here, and then I'll select it again from this quadrant. And you'll notice that that arrow is now pointing clockwise, which is what I want. It's my climb milling operation. I'm going to hit the green check mark on OK. And then I'm going to go back into tool because I don't need to change my toolpath type. And once again, I'll have to look for a specific tool. So I'm going to use a 5/8 end mill in this instance. And once again, I'll go into filter and then I'll select none. And I'm looking for a flat end mill, which is our first selection. And then select tool library. And I'm going to look for a 5/8 flat end mill. So right there, tool 292. Hit the green check mark. And I'm just going to title this 5/8 rough contour. And then I'll go down in here to holder. We're going to leave that default. Cut parameters. We're going to leave the compensation type as the computer because that's how we selected it. We're already going clockwise in this instance. And cutter compensation, we're going to leave left. Tip compensation, that's fine. And then we're just going to leave some stock on the wall. So in this instance, I'm going to leave about 5 thousandths on stock wall and then 5 thousandths on stock floor. We'll go to depth cuts. We're going to go the full length of the tool here. That's totally fine. And then we're going to go lead in, lead out. This is important. This is like what I was talking about with the thick to thin chips. We don't want to just crash our tool into the side of the part and then move up in terms of the geometry. So think of this kind of like a Formula One race car. If you're going like 200 miles an hour and you want to take a turn, well, you have to slow up and then ease into that turn as you're curving into it. You don't want to just go straight in and plunge to the left. So these tangency loops are going to help us with our lead in, lead out. It's just creating a nice arc to kind of ease the tool into the side of the part as it's cutting. So I'm going to leave this all stock here. If I wanted to change it, if my work holding was a little thinner, I could adjust that. Go over here to linking parameters. We can turn on our clearance. We can change that to 1. Retract, we'll do absolute, 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 absolute. So again, this is a pretty interesting instance where I have my top of stock. It's recognizing that the top of stock is still set from the stock setup that we had. Well, that's cut away now with that milling or that facing operation. So we're going to choose the top of stock to be 0. We can type it in, obviously, but we can also click on top of stock, and I can select anywhere on that wireframe there. So that top of stock will be 0. And then I'll hit the green check mark. So you can see I have toolpath that is now going around the contour of that island. This is just a roughing operation where I'm just kind of cleaning up the outside there. And I want to use this as an example because the way that I've explained G-code in other lectures is that we want to create an offset or a cleanup before we get to this finished face. And you'll notice something that's interesting between 2 different ways we can view this toolpath. So for example, the first kind of way that we can view it is that back plot, which as I showed you right here. And if I see this tool and I hit the play button, nothing looks terribly out of the ordinary here. It's going to just travel around the face of the island or the tangency loop of the island, and it's going to exit out on the left here. And this all looks good, but right here is where we're going to see a problem with the next simulation that we're going to do with our toolpath, and I want you to keep that in mind. So instead of using the back plot now, I'm going to now select verify, which is the little half pipe that's next to the back plot option. So I'll click on verify. Sometimes you have to click through this a couple times. It's going to default to a machine. Sometimes it's not finding the post for it. So click X. You can also hit OK, OK, X on that, and then go ahead and click it once again. Okay, so now I can see my stock material with the tool there. And if I click the play button, look at that. So if I rewind that, I slow it down. Let me slow it down first and then rewind it. Again, everything looks good, but right here, I'm going to move our play button back here a little bit. Right here, this is going to be a problem. So we've given an opportunity for the tool to cut 100% of its diameter, and it's going to probably overload that tool with chips. And there's a good instance where this tool might even break, it might dull it or mar it, or create a lot of chatter. So we don't want to be in this instance where we're cutting down this deep with the length of the tool, and then also have 100% engagement from this side to this side. So we have this little pylon that's left over if we don't have a cleanup portion of material there. So I'm going to hit X here, and I'm going to then add another piece of geometry into this to make that cleanup a little bit easier. So we're going to be exploring on how to add toolpath and move toolpath around, and the way that we do that is using this little red arrow here in the feature tree. So I'm going to move this up 1 instance so it's above this contour. So I'm going to click on the red arrow up, and at this point here, now I'm going to add another piece of geometry. So I'm just going to add a nice square rectangle cleanup around that edge so we can get rid of that pylon that's left over. So I'll go over here back into toolpaths, I'll select contour once again, and I'm actually going to fake MasterCam out a little bit with this one. I'm going to do a rectangle cleanup on the entire outside. So I'm going to select that whole rectangle right there, and then I'm going to hit the green check mark. And from here, I'm going to then select the same 5/8 flat end mill, and I'll do a 5/8. It's a rough offset, and then I'll go into cut parameters, and instead of leaving a stock to wall at 5/1000ths, I'm actually going to fake this out in the sense that if I was going to travel around this rectangle and leave 5/1000ths of stock cleanup, well, it would never touch the part. But I want to be inside the part. So what I'm going to do, instead of creating all these different wireframes and then offsets and all that stuff, well, I'm going to select the stock to leave on wall, and I'm going to type in negative 0.130. And what I'm doing is I'm actually stepping it from that outside edge, and I'm saying go offset negative, so it's then going to be inside the part. And then I'll leave stock leave on floors 5/1000ths as well. All this should be the same. Linking parameters, we'll just change that top of stock to 0, and then hit the green check mark. So now, if I want to see all of these operations simulated, I'll select toolpath group 1 inside of my feature tree here. So I have the facing, contour, and then contour 2D selected. And then now I'll go into verify. And if I want to see the difference between these tools, I'm going to go over here to the verify tab over here, and I'm going to change this to color loop. So I'm going to turn my color loop on. So now every time a tool makes a cut, that color loop will be represented by a different color. So I'm going to slow this down again, and I'm going to then hit play. So we'll see that facing, and then this will be that offset contour, and then there is going to be the island profile. So take a look at that. We got rid of that extra little pylon that was there that would have then created 100% engagement of the tool, which could end up hurting the tool in the sense that it could break or that it would dull a lot quicker. So all we have to do now, if we want to finish this up, because these were roughing operations, we're leaving stock on the walls. If I want to then create finish passes of these, all I have to do is I have to move my operation arrow down. So that's going to be the red arrow. I'll move it one step down, so it's then below all these pieces of geometry. I will select and hold down the shift key on the second and the third operation. So this is going to be the contour offset, and this will be the contour island. So I'll select both of those while holding down the control key or the shift key, and then I'll right click on them, and then I'm going to choose copy. So I'm going to copy these two operations, and then underneath it, I'm going to then right click where that red arrow is, and then select paste. So then it just pasted those exact operations, but now all we have to do now is change them from stock to leave on wall, 5/1000ths or whatever it was. I'm going to make it 0. So go in here to parameters, and I'll go into cut parameters, and instead of stock to leave on wall, this one I'm going to make it -125 because that's going to be the step over to the exact offset there, and then I'll make this 0, and then I'll change my tool note to be, instead of rough offset, I'm going to make this finish offset. And if we wanted to, we're not going to see this in this specific tool library because it's default, but I would have a finish tool and a roughing tool. So that way, like, I'm taking way less cuts on those finish tools, but I'll run them way faster and give a nicer finish. So in this instance, you're not going to see the benefit of it as much, but in a more real world example, you'll see that benefit in that you can do a lot of cutting with that roughing operation, and then you can do more fine cutting at a faster pace with a finish tool. So then I would select a finish tool in this instance, but I'm going to use that 5/8 flat end mill once again, and then I'll hit the green check mark, and I'll go back into the fifth operation here, which is going to be that island, and then instead of it being the rough contour, I'm going to title that finish contour, and then I'll go over here to my cut parameters. For stock to leave on wall, I'll make that 0, and stock to leave on floor, I'll make that 0. and then hit the green check mark. So then when I zoom in to these toolpaths, you can see that offset that I'm creating. That's that 5 thousandths for approaching with the roughing tool, and then the 5 thousandths is just going to be the finishing tool in this instance. So now I'll go over here to my toolpath group 1. I'll select everything, and then I'll select my verify selected operations, and then I'll zoom this out a little bit, and I'll hit the play button once again. And that's going to be my roughing offset, roughing contour, finish offset, and then finish contour. And we're going to end the video there. I'll move into slots and pockets after this. But as far as islands and facing and 2D contours, this is a really good start for you all to play around with. Close out of that, and we can also save this as well. All right, we will catch you on the next one.